Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Saturday, May 30th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. In Riverside today, we're looking at a high of 78.7 degrees and a low of 54.6 degrees, so it should be a very pleasant day to be outside. On the program, we are looking at the factors driving the intensified Israeli military campaign in Lebanon. We are also examining the impact that a catastrophic launch pad explosion might have on the American effort to get back to the moon. In addition to these primary reports, we have coverage on several other important developments shaping our world this weekend. We will bring you the full context and the latest updates on all of these situations, along with a variety of other stories you need to know. All this and much more is coming up on Alex's News. Stick around. Good morning, everyone. We're starting today with a major escalation in the Middle East, where Israel has dramatically widened its military campaign in Lebanon and bombed Beirut for the first time in weeks. It's all putting serious pressure on a fragile ceasefire and on high-stakes talks between the Trump administration and Iran. Here to walk us through it is our reporter, Ethan. Ethan, good morning. Let's start with that strike on the Lebanese capital. What happened?
Good morning, Grace. According to Democracy Now! And the Associated Press, Israel broke a 22-day pause in strikes on Beirut 2 days ago, on May 28th. The Israel Defense Forces carried out what they describe as a precision airstrike in Shuaifat, a suburb just south of Beirut, very close to the international airport. The Times of Israel and other regional outlets identified the target as Ali al-Husni, also referred to as Ali al-Husseini. He's described as the head of the missile division of the Imam Hussein division, an Iranian-linked militia operating alongside Hezbollah.
So this wasn't a random target. But what's surprising is the timing, right? The U.S. had been pushing for restraint.
That's exactly the tension here. The Trump administration has been working hard to keep Lebanon's government from collapsing entirely. But Israeli officials say this specific operation was actually preceded by, quote, intense dialogue, end quote, with Washington. That suggests either a shift in the U.S. position or what Israeli intelligence called a unique opportunity to take out a high-value target. 3 civilians were killed in that strike, including a woman and a baby, which has further inflamed tensions.
And while that strike was happening in Beirut, there's also a much bigger ground story unfolding in southern Lebanon. Walk us through those new displacement orders.
Right, this is really the heart of the escalation. As NPR and PBS have reported, the IDF declared all areas south of the Zaharani River an active combat zone. That river sits roughly 40 kilometers, or about 25 miles, north of the Israeli border. The order covers something like 20% of Lebanon's landmass, and that includes the major cities of Tyre and Nabatea. These are the most aggressive displacement orders we've seen since the April 2026 ceasefire took hold.
20% of the country is a staggering footprint. What does that mean for civilians on the ground?
The humanitarian toll is grim, Grace. Democracy Now! Reported that 15 children were among those killed by Israeli strikes over just the past week, with at least 62 more children wounded. The total death toll of what's being called the 2026 Lebanon War, which began back in March, has now exceeded 3,200 people. And more than 1 million residents have been displaced. We're talking about a really significant share of Lebanon's population pushed from their homes.
And there are cultural sites at risk too, aren't there? Some of these places are ancient.
Yes, and that's drawing real international concern. NPR noted that bombing has occurred within 100 meters of the ancient ruins in Tyre, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Area. The historic Beaufort Castle, which dates back centuries, has reportedly sustained direct hits. So beyond the immediate human cost, there's growing alarm about irreversible damage to sites of enormous historical and cultural value to the region.
Now, Israel says it has a specific technical reason for pushing this combat zone so far north. Tell us about these new drones.
This is fascinating and a little underreported. According to NBC News, the Associated Press, and Wired, Hezbollah has introduced what they're calling fiber blade drones. These are advanced first-person view drones, but with a twist. Instead of being radio-controlled, they're tethered to their operator by an ultra-thin fiber optic cable. That makes them essentially unjammable. The electronic warfare and GPS spoofing the IDF normally relies on just don't work against them. So Israel is framing this whole expansion as a defensive necessity.
But not everyone is buying that justification. What are independent analysts saying?
There's a real discrepancy here, Grace. Military analysts, cited by Reuters and Modern Diplomacy, point out that these fiber optic drones, while lethal, have a pretty limited operational range. We're talking about 10 to 30 kilometers at most because the cable adds weight and drag. So when Israel pushes the combat zone 40 kilometers north to the Zahrani River, critics argue the drone threat is being used as a pretext. The real goal, they say, is establishing a permanent security buffer zone inside Lebanese territory.
And the Israeli Prime Minister has actually talked about that, hasn't he?
He has. The Guardian and the Times of Israel have highlighted statements from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu about the, quote, fortification of the security strip, end quote. Some analysts are calling this a Gaza model of territorial control, meaning a long-term Israeli military footprint deep inside a neighbor's borders. That's a really significant policy shift, and it's one of the reasons this moment feels so volatile. A buffer zone of that size is hard to walk back.
Let's pivot to the diplomatic side, because all of this is happening while the Trump administration is trying to lock down a deal with Iran. Where do those talks stand?
Yesterday, on May 29th, President Trump held a 2-hour Situation Room meeting to review a tentative deal with Tehran. According to NPR, Vice President J.D. Vance said that while the U.S. is, quote, not there, end quote, on a final agreement, they are, quote, very close, end quote. So there's cautious optimism in Washington. But the gap between very close and actually done is where everything could fall apart, especially given what's happening in Lebanon right now.
What are the main components of this proposed deal?
There are essentially 3 red lines the administration is pushing. First, nuclear constraints. Iran would have to agree to never possess nuclear weapons and allow the removal of stockpiles of highly enriched uranium. Second, maritime security, meaning the immediate reopening of the Strait of Hormuz without tolls or harassment of shipping. And third, a regional ceasefire, specifically a 60-day extension of the current truce. Each of those is a heavy lift on its own.
And Iran has its own non-negotiable demand, right? That's where Lebanon comes back in.
Exactly, and this is where everything connects. According to CBS News and The Hindu, Tehran is insisting any final deal must include a comprehensive ceasefire in Lebanon. Iran views the defense of Hezbollah as non-negotiable, so when that May 28th strike hit Shuaifat and killed civilians, Iranian officials accused the United States of, quote, bad faith, end quote, for allowing its ally to bomb the Lebanese capital during active negotiations. That's a serious diplomatic wound right in the middle of talks.
So how is the Trump administration trying to manage both pressure and diplomacy at the same time?
They're calling it negotiating while squeezing. The Treasury Department just rolled out new sanctions on Iran's military oil sales arm, so the maximum pressure campaign continues. But at the same time, the Pentagon is hosting direct security talks between Israeli and Lebanese military delegations. It's a really delicate balancing act, trying to keep Iran at the table while signaling to Israel that the U.S. still backs its security concerns. Whether you can do both at once is the open question.
And what are observers saying about the overall climate for these negotiations?
One phrase that keeps coming up is negotiating on fumes. Between the expansion of the combat zone to the Zahrani River and the return of bombings to Beirut, the environment is just incredibly fragile. U.S. officials remain cautiously optimistic in public, but the fate of this U.S.-Iran peace deal is now inextricably linked to what happens on the ground in Lebanon. Every airstrike potentially blows up months of diplomatic work.
So as we look ahead from today, May 30th, what should our listeners be watching for in the coming days?
3 things, Grace. First, whether that combat zone south of the Zahrani River expands further or holds where it is. Second, whether the Trump administration can keep Iran at the negotiating table despite the civilian casualties in Shuaifat. And third, whether the Pentagon talks between Israeli and Lebanese delegations produce anything concrete. Any one of those could tip this either toward a broader regional war or toward the breakthrough the White House says is within reach.
A truly fluid and dangerous moment. Ethan, thank you so much for breaking all of this down for us this morning.
Happy to do it, Grace.
That's our reporter, Ethan. We'll have much more news right after this. And now to our second big story this morning, a major setback for the commercial space industry on Florida's Space Coast. A Blue Origin rocket exploded during a ground test just 2 nights ago, and the cleanup is only beginning. Our space and science reporter Chloe has been tracking this since the blast lit up the sky Thursday night. Chloe, good morning. Walk us through what actually happened.
Good morning, Grace. So around 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, May 28th, Blue Origin was running what's called a static fire or hot fire test at Launch Complex 36 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. The idea is simple. You bolt the rocket to the pad and briefly ignite the engines to make sure everything works. But according to the Los Angeles Times and CBS News, something went very wrong at the base of the first stage as the 7 BE-4 engines began to light. Within seconds, the entire vehicle was engulfed in an orange fireball.
That's a 321-foot rocket, right? How big was the blast?
Enormous, Grace. We're talking about a 98-meter vehicle, and Space.com reports the fire spread up the 188-foot first stage until it collapsed. Then the 86-foot upper stage fell into the inferno, and that's when the really catastrophic explosion happened, because the upper stage was loaded with liquid oxygen and liquefied natural gas. The fireball was visible from 115 miles away in Fort Pierce. Windows rattled in nearby neighborhoods, and people miles away thought there'd been an earthquake.
And remarkably, no one was hurt?
That's right. Blue Origin confirmed there were no deaths and no injuries, which is honestly extraordinary given the scale of what we're seeing in the aerial footage. Because it was a ground test, the pad area had been cleared of personnel, which is standard procedure. The Associated Press published photos that one analyst described as, quote, absolute carnage, end quote. So while the human cost is essentially zero, the property damage is staggering.
Now, you mentioned the rocket had a nickname. Tell me about this specific vehicle.
Yeah, this was the 4th New Glenn rocket built, designated NG-4, and it was reportedly nicknamed, quote, no, it's necessary, end quote. A little bit of dark humor in hindsight. According to U.S. News and World Report, this same rocket was scheduled to launch 48 Amazon Project Kuiper internet satellites just next week. Thankfully, those satellites were not on the rocket during the test, so they're safe, but their deployment is now delayed indefinitely.
Let's talk about the public safety angle. I understand officials are warning Floridians about debris washing ashore.
This is really important for anyone listening along the Florida coast. By Friday morning, yesterday, the U.S. Space Force's Space Launch Delta 45 issued an urgent public alert. ABC News and NPR affiliates are reporting that the explosion sent debris into the Atlantic Ocean, and specialized wreckage is expected to wash up on beaches over the coming weeks. We're talking sharp metal fragments, composite materials, batteries, and pressurized components.
And some of that material could be toxic?
Exactly. The wreckage may be contaminated with hazardous propellants, including residue from that liquid oxygen and methane mix. The Guardian and PBS both report that officials are strictly telling people, do not touch the debris, do not approach it, do not try to take it home as a souvenir. Instead, call 911 or your local authorities and let trained crews handle the removal. This is going to be a recurring issue along that coastline for weeks.
Let's turn to the launch site itself. How bad is the damage at Launch Complex 36?
It's devastating, Grace. The transporter erector, which is the massive structure used to move and raise the rocket onto the pad, was completely destroyed. One of the site's 3 towering lightning protection masts was actually toppled by the blast. And here's a piece of history that makes this sting even more. U.S. News and World Report notes that Blue Origin spent more than $1 billion rebuilding LC-36. It's a historic site that previously hosted NASA's Mariner and Pioneer probes back in the 1960s.
How long are we looking at before they can launch from there again?
Industry analysts speaking to Space Explored and CBS News estimate the repairs will take somewhere between 12 and 24 months. And here's the kicker, this is Blue Origin's only active pad for New Glenn. They have a second pad, LC-36B, but it's still under construction and at least a year away from being operational. So in industry terms, this is a, quote, single point of failure, end quote. The entire New Glenn fleet is effectively grounded indefinitely.
That has to ripple out to NASA's plans for getting back to the moon. What's the impact on Artemis?
Significant. The new NASA administrator, Jared Isaacman, who was sworn in as the 15th administrator back in December 2025, said late Thursday that the agency is evaluating near-term impacts on the Artemis program. According to the LA Times and The Guardian, New Glenn is the primary vehicle meant to launch Blue Origin's Blue Moon landers. A prototype uncrewed cargo lander called the Blue Moon Mark I was supposed to fly this fall. That's now grounded.
And Artemis 4, the actual crewed moon landing, when was that supposed to happen?
Artemis 4 was aiming to put astronauts on the lunar surface as early as 2028. That timeline is now in serious doubt. Isaacman, who's known for what people call his, quote, urgency and iterative design, end quote, philosophy, suggested NASA may have to lean more heavily on SpaceX's Starship or Falcon 9 to keep momentum going. The complication there is that SpaceX is also dealing with its own regulatory issues after anomalies during a test flight on May 22nd, about a week ago.
So it's not like there's just one easy backup option waiting in the wings.
Not at all. The commercial space sector has been working hard to build redundancy, but right now both major American heavy lift options are under some form of scrutiny. And Blue Origin's troubles don't stop at NASA. There's a real question now about the BE-4 engine itself, which is the same engine that powers United Launch Alliance's Vulcan rocket.
Tell me more about that. Is Vulcan grounded too?
Not officially grounded, no. The FAA has not grounded Vulcan because Thursday's explosion happened during a non-licensed ground test, which falls outside their normal jurisdiction. However, the Space Force has maintained a, quote, pause, end quote, on Vulcan missions carrying national security payloads. Tech Times and GeekWire report that investigators want to determine whether this failure was caused by a systemic design flaw in the BE-4 engine before they let Vulcan fly sensitive missions again.
And this isn't the first stumble for New Glenn this year, is it?
No, and that's part of why this is so painful for Blue Origin. This is the second major failure in just 2 months. Back in April 2026, an upper stage issue during the NG-3 mission left a satellite in the wrong orbit. Before that, New Glenn had only one fully successful mission, which was NG-2, back in November 2025. So out of 4 flights, they've had 1 clean success, 1 partial failure, and now 1 catastrophic loss before the rocket even left the pad.
Meanwhile, the competition isn't slowing down.
Not even a little, Grace. In what really illustrates the rivalry on the Space Coast, SpaceX launched a batch of Starlink satellites from a nearby pad just 12 hours after Blue Origin's explosion. 12 hours. Elon Musk's company is maintaining this incredibly high launch cadence, while Blue Origin is staring down a grueling federal investigation and a multi-year reconstruction project. The contrast couldn't really be sharper.
So what are you watching for next in the coming days?
3 things mainly. First, the debris situation along Florida's beaches, because that's an immediate public safety concern that's going to develop over the next several weeks. Second, the FAA and Space Force investigations into the BE-4 engine, because the findings there will determine when Vulcan can fly national security missions again. And third, any formal announcement from Administrator Isaacman about how NASA plans to restructure the Artemis timeline. We should know a lot more by the middle of next week.
Chloe, terrific reporting on a really complicated story. Thanks so much for breaking it all down for us this morning.
Happy to be here, Grace.
That's our space and science reporter, Chloe, with the latest on the Blue Origin New Glenn explosion at Cape Canaveral. We'll have more updates throughout the morning right here. Here are some other headlines. European intelligence officials have warned about Russian agencies working overtime to steal Western secrets and maintain Moscow's military production. Intelligence chiefs from Sweden, Finland, Estonia, and the United Kingdom report that Russia is using shell companies and intermediaries in Turkey to bypass 4 years of international sanctions. They are being quite shellfish by hoarding technology meant for aerospace research, targeting Sweden's Gripen fighter jet program, quantum computing, and satellite systems. Christopher Wedelin of Swedish Security and Juha Martelius of Finland's intelligence wing noted that Moscow is laser-focused on dual-use tech like high-precision machine tools. Ann Keast-Butler of GCHQ noted that Russia is relentlessly targeting allies and is more than willing to spark trouble, as seen in a thwarted attempt to sabotage a Swedish power plant. Across the Pacific, the United States is developing a negative image with China after the Trump administration revoked the visa of a Chinese national working for Xinhua news agency. This move was a reciprocal response to Beijing's decision to show New York Times correspondent Vivian Wang the door. Beijing found a recent interview with Taiwanese President Lai Ching-te to be a bridge too far. Joseph Kahn says reporting on the global economy is becoming alarmingly difficult as bureaus work with skeleton crews. While Secretary of State Marco Rubio is trying to keep things on a level plane, the media exchange remains quite taxing. In a move that caught many off guard, General Francis Donovan of United States Southern Command met with Cuban General Roberto Legra Sotolongo at the perimeter of Naval Station Guantanamo Bay. While the two nations have been fencing for years, this brief exchange on operational security was described as positive. Even though the United States has been baying for change with the fuel blockade and the deployment of the USS Nimitz carrier strike group, they managed to find common ground at the fence line. CIA Director John Ratcliffe has also been involved in maintaining these narrow channels of communication. Health officials are going batty trying to contain a new Ebola outbreak in the Congo and Uganda. There are currently 125 confirmed cases and 906 suspected ones. This Bundibugyo strain is a viral sensation for all the wrong reasons, as it lacks an approved vaccine. World Health Organization Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus is calling for a ceasefire to reach those in need. Experts warn the resurgence is linked to the consumption of wild animals, proving some habits are hard to kill. Finally, a strike in Newark is entering its 9th day as 200 detainees at Delaney Hall continue their hunger and labor protest. They are trying to worm their way out of inhumane conditions after finding live larvae in their meals. Tensions became heated when federal agents used pepper spray, catching Senator Andy Kim in the fray. Governor Mikey Sherrill deployed state police to lower the temperature, though Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen claims the strike is a hoax. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King, with Claude Opus 4.6, Gemini Pro 3.1, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.